My fiancé's savior had been diagnosed with cancer. He only had a few days left to live. He had never been in a relationship his whole life. His only wish was to leave a descendant for the Ito family. So, without hesitation, my child-free fiancée agreed to do IVF for him. And to prove her sincerity, she even declared with affection, "Makoto, to fulfill your wish, no matter how many rounds of IVF it takes, I will endure it." Everyone waited to see me make a fool of myself. And yet, I calmly gave it a like and commented, "If you two truly love each other, then this is where we part ways." After posting the comment, I quietly put away my phone, devoid of any emotion. By all logic, a man should be furious when his longtime fiancé cheats on him and betrays him for another man. But me, I couldn't even summon anger, because I had already accepted the reality. Willow didn't love me. 6 months ago, Willow suddenly told me she wanted to have a child for her true love. "Makoto," she said, "Makoto is sick. He doesn't have much time left. His only wish is to have a child to carry on his bloodline. That's all he's asking, and I can't deny him that." Chapter 1. When I first heard that, I immediately said no. What man could possibly accept his soon-to-be wife having a baby for someone else, especially that someone being the man she's never gotten over? At first, Willow was still calm and tried to reason with me, but eventually, she began to scold me with righteous fury. She said, "Why are you so cold-hearted? Makoto saved my life. What's wrong with giving him a child? My uterus is mine. You have no right to control it." I had heard that line countless times. Then, a month ago, Willow suddenly stopped the endless arguments. I thought she had finally given up on the idea. Turns out, she had already gone ahead with the IVF. Now, she's carrying Makoto's baby, and our wedding, it's just 1 month away. I knew exactly what Willow was thinking. She wanted to wait until it was a done deal. Once we were married and had our certificate, I'd have no choice but to accept her pregnancy. When I first found out, I was devastated. But now, I feel a strange sense of relief. I can still walk away from a woman who shamelessly hurt me, from someone who has no love left for me. Suddenly, my phone chimed. I unlocked it to find a voice message from Willow. She snapped, "George, what the hell is wrong with you? What kind of nonsense are you spouting on WeChat? Are you trying to make me a laughingstock? So what if I'm having a baby with Makoto? What does that have to do with you? If you don't want to be with me, then let's just break up and forget the wedding next month while you're at it. Yeah, there's really no need for it anymore." I stared coldly at my phone, looking through our chat history. It was mostly just me texting her, asking what she wanted to eat, what she liked, telling her I'd pick her up after work, or take her out to relax. But Willow's replies were always indifferent and cold. Okay, whatever. I'm busy. Go by yourself. I have to take care of Makoto. Bring some soup over if you have time. Makoto's feeling down. I'm going to be with him. In the end, our few and far between chats were all about Makoto. Now that I've decided to let go, I suddenly realized I'd been acting like a total doormat. No matter what Willow did, I tolerated it. The thought made me bitter. Just then, Willow called. "You've really grown some nerve," she said. "Now you won't even pick up my calls. Let me tell you something, George. You'd better explain that my pregnancy was all your idea and your consent." Her voice was as impatient as ever. I felt a pang of something, but it was followed by complete calm. I asked, "Do you really take me for a clown? After doing something this disgusting, do you even care what people think anymore?" Willow blew up instantly. She snapped, "Was that really necessary? Makoto has cancer. Why are you jealous of a dying man? If you truly loved me, you'd support me." Her self-righteous tone made me laugh out loud. She always said lovers should support and rely on each other. But deep down, did she ever truly see me as her other half? I didn't want to argue anymore, so I just hung up. Chapter 2. After that fight with Willow, we didn't talk for several days, which was just as well. I finally had time to focus on things at the lab. Before, because of all the drama with Willow, I couldn't fully concentrate during experiments. On top of that, I had already taken multiple days off to prepare for the wedding. But now, I wasn't going to waste any more of my time on Willow. Thinking of what my professor told me before, I gathered myself and redialed my senior's number. A few seconds after it rang, her bright, clear voice came through the line. "Hello, George, what's up?" "I've made up my mind, senpai," I said. "I want to join the professor's lab." 6 months ago, my professor had set up a new research lab, a closed one. Once you joined, you couldn't leave until the project was complete. Sometimes it lasted 1 or 2 years, sometimes longer. There was no fixed timeline. The professor had known about my relationship with Willow. To help me join without regrets, he'd even arranged a break so I could spend time with her before going in. But I hesitated, thinking about how long I'd be apart from Willow. Now though, Willow was pregnant with another man's child. She had never once considered my feelings, never once respected our relationship. There was no reason for me to keep sacrificing my dreams for her. So, I took a deep breath and calmly said, "Senpai, I'll join the professor's lab and there's no need to schedule any extra time off for me." She was thrilled. "Great, the professor said we'll be leaving in about half a month. Would that work for you?" I paused for a second. Half a month from now, that would be the day of my wedding with Willow. What a coincidence. "Yeah," I replied. "I'll be at the airport on time." After ending the call, I pulled out a red pen and circled the date. 15 days left. In 15 days, I'd be completely free from Willow. To be honest, after 5 years together, I'd always known Willow's compromise. We were childhood friends. Everyone around us, from family to friends, thought we were a perfect match. Our families were evenly matched, and truth be told, I had already fallen in love with her during those years growing up together. But once we actually got together, I realized she didn't love me. Not really. For her, it was more about practicality. We knew each other well, our families were compatible, and our parents supported us. All the boxes for a perfect marriage were checked. I used to believe that, in time, Willow would eventually choose me because of my sincerity. But after she got pregnant, I finally woke up. Everything I'd held on to had been nothing but a pitiful joke. Without love, I was nothing. In 5 years of dating, Willow had always been guarded around me. She never let me touch her phone. I remember once, my phone had died. I instinctively picked up hers to check the time. She snatched it from my hand immediately. "What are you doing?" she snapped, frowning. Her overreaction made me feel awkward. I explained I just wanted to know what time it was, but she didn't believe me. She was convinced I was checking up on her and started a huge fight. From that day on, I never touched her phone again. There were so many moments like that. Between us, there was always an invisible wall, something I couldn't cross. We were never like other couples, no sweetness, no leaning on each other. I tried so hard to love her, to accommodate her, but she always found some excuse to push me away. It was like I was just her backup plan. Sometimes, when Willow was in a good mood, she'd treat me kindly, and in those rare moments, I would forget all the past imbalance between us. I'd hold on to that tiny scrap of affection like it was everything. There's a saying, those who are favored always act with impunity. And Willow, she knew it, and took full advantage. Chapter 3. That evening, Willow suddenly came back. She saw me and casually tossed her bag in my direction. Annoyed, she said, "George, you've really grown a spine. Huh? You even have the nerve to give me the cold shoulder." I dodged it. I glanced at her and said coldly, "What? Should I just wait around to serve you while you carry another man's baby?" Willow's eyes flew wide open. The anger on her face twisted her otherwise beautiful features. She snapped, "George, do you have to talk to me in that passive-aggressive tone? Makoto isn't just anyone, he saved my life. George, you don't love me nearly as much as you claim. You're just a selfish and emotionally detached man." I almost laughed at the tone she was using. Willow, who had been spoiled since she was a child, never once considered anyone else's feelings. She had clearly fallen for Makoto, yet she still insisted it was all out of gratitude. But out of all the ways to repay a debt, did it have to be by having his child? Back then, I could tolerate Willow's spoiled temper. I loved her, so I accepted everything about her. But love that gets no response, it's exhausting. So when I looked at the furious Willow, I simply sneered and said, "Well, since you feel that way, why don't we just break up?" Hearing that, Willow's eyes went wide with shock. She bit her lip. "You actually dare bring up breaking up with me? Fine, George, you need to cool off." Maybe it was my calm attitude that unsettled her. Willow suddenly looked flustered and rushed out the door. She might have been bold enough to flaunt her love for Makoto online, but if the Liu family found out their daughter got pregnant with another man's child before marriage, Willow wouldn't suffer the consequences, but Makoto would definitely be sent away by the Liu family. The next day, I was getting ready to leave and join a closed-off research lab, so I called a few close friends out for dinner and took the chance to tell them the wedding was off. To my surprise, they actually let out a sigh of relief when they heard. One of them said, "George, we all know you loved Willow, but honestly, it was obvious to all of us, she never loved you." Another chimed in, "Yeah, man, canceling the wedding was the right call. You can't force love, it just doesn't work." Their words struck a chord of bitterness deep in my chest. Yeah, who couldn't see that Willow never loved me? From beginning to end, the only one who truly cared about this relationship was me. I kept thinking maybe one day, I'd finally get Willow's genuine affection, but fate didn't give me that chance. Only after Makoto appeared did I finally see what Willow looked like when she truly loved someone. She would cook virtually for him, despite having never set foot in a kitchen her entire life. She would care for him personally, even though she had a serious cleanliness obsession. She was willing to wipe Makoto's body herself, and more than anything, it was about her attitude. She was always focused, always serious when it came to Makoto. If it was about him, Willow would care more than anyone. So really, me stepping away, wasn't that a good thing? I drained my glass in one bitter gulp. With that heavy feeling in my chest, I drank with my friends until midnight before heading home. But I didn't expect to see Willow again. She was sitting in the living room when I walked in. She looked up and said directly, "I need to talk to you about something." My steps toward the bedroom halted. The first time I heard those words was 2 months ago, when Willow told me she wanted to have Makoto's child. And now that she was pregnant, what drama was she about to stir up this time? Chapter 4. She said, "Don't bother going for the wedding photos tomorrow." I glanced at the calendar on the table. Tomorrow's date had wedding photos written across it in thick marker. I didn't know why Willow wanted to cancel the photo shoot, but I wasn't planning to go through with the wedding anyway. Even if she hadn't said it, I would have found an excuse to cancel. Her suggestion just saved me the trouble. I nodded and replied, "All right, I'll call the photographer and cancel the shoot." Willow froze for a moment. She hadn't expected me to agree so easily. She thought I'd at least ask why. After all, I had carefully planned every detail of the wedding for months. Even the photographer I booked for the shoot was someone I paid extra just to get an earlier slot. Also, we could have the perfect wedding photos. But she didn't expect me to stay so calm and agree without hesitation. Willow looked at me, a complex expression on her face. She said, "Actually, don't cancel. Makoto said he'll never have the chance to get married in this lifetime. So he wanted to take wedding photos with me, just so he can feel like he's been married once and won't have regrets. Let him shoot with me tomorrow. We'll just take new ones later for ourselves." Willow's tone was light, as if she were just deciding what to eat today. Just like a month ago when she casually told me she wanted to have artificial insemination for Makoto. It sounded like she was discussing something with me, but everything in her words made it clear, the decision had already been made. She was only informing me out of courtesy. My lowered gaze hid the bitterness in my eyes. Later. She still didn't know. I only had 13 more days left in the city. She didn't know there wouldn't be a later. I quietly replied, "All right," then headed to the bedroom to rest. Since we weren't going to get married anyway, it didn't matter who Willow took wedding photos with. Willow looked at my back and felt an inexplicable unease. I was far too calm. I didn't question anything. It left her entire speech prepared for convincing me completely useless. But then Makoto called. Whatever doubts she had vanished. She went to the balcony to take the call. When I woke up the next morning, Willow was just about to leave. As she put on her shoes, she reminded me. "After the photo shoot, Makoto and I are going on a short trip. He's always wanted to go to Hokkaido, so I'll go with him. As for the wedding, keep it simple. I won't have time to rehearse or arrange anything. Just make all the decisions. No need to ask me." I swallowed a bite of toast and replied, "Okay, keep it simple." There would be no wedding photos, no guests, no officiant, and no groom. Willow glanced at me quietly eating breakfast and added, "Let's go to Europe for our honeymoon after the wedding. I remember you've always wanted to go." If it had been in the past, hearing Willow propose a honeymoon herself would have made me overjoyed. I'd have started planning the whole trip immediately. After all, I'd begged her to travel with me before, but she always refused, saying she didn't like traveling, that it was too exhausting. Now, I just focused on my bread and said nothing. Willow looked surprised. She wanted to say more, but after glancing at the clock on the wall, she hurried out the door, leaving behind only a "we'll talk when I get back." I picked up the calendar and drew a huge X through the words, "wedding photos," with a marker. 12 days left. After breakfast, I started packing my things, clearing out everything I wouldn't need anymore. The photo album with fewer than 5 pictures, the dusty projector, the couple's pajamas that were never worn. In 5 years together, I had personally picked out every single item in this home, slowly turning an empty apartment into a warm, cozy space. But when you looked closer, most things were never used by Willow. She always said, even if we were dating, she was still her own person. She didn't like couple items. They made her feel like she was constantly being tied down. After I left, all this stuff would only be an eyesore to her anyway. Might as well clean it out now, and erase every trace of our memories along with it. Chapter 5. Willow didn't come back for an entire week, but I still knew exactly what she was doing, thanks to Makoto, who seemed addicted to tweeting every little thing. The two of them went to hot springs together, watched the ocean, took sunrise selfies. In his posts, I saw yet another version of Willow, so she could act like an ordinary girl in love, just not in front of me. I didn't pay too much attention to where they went or what they did. I'd just glance at the tweets and quickly scroll past. I wasn't idle either. There was way too much stuff in the house. It took me several days to finally sort and clean everything. I also took a short trip home to tell my parents I was about to enter the closed research lab, and that I wouldn't be able to contact the outside world regularly once I started. My dad looked surprised and asked, "But you and Willow are about to get married. Wouldn't that mean you'll be living apart?" There was worry in my mom's eyes too. She held my hand and gently said, "Think carefully. Son, you and Willow finally made it this far. I'm just afraid that if you go into the lab, she might not agree to it. And the wedding. I understood exactly what they meant. They had watched me devote myself to Willow all these years, and they were also well aware of how she treated me. Before I proposed, they had already tried to talk me out of it, kindly, but clearly they thought I didn't matter enough to Willow and suggested I think it through again. But back then, I was so confident I could change her, make her accept me fully. So in the end, they gave their blessing. Now, with the wedding so close, they were worried that if I left for the lab, Willow wouldn't accept it. Or worse, she might cancel the wedding and break up with me. They were just trying to protect me from getting hurt. But this time, the one canceling the wedding was me. When I told them, they went silent for a long time. I didn't tell them Willow was pregnant with another man's child. I was afraid that kind of truth would break them. I simply said I wanted to keep contributing to the scientific field. My dad sighed and patted me on the shoulder, saying as long as I wouldn't regret it, that was enough. I nodded. When I got home, I called my childhood friend David over to help me carry all the boxes I'd packed. They were stacked high in the living room, taking up a lot of space. Once everything was out, the room instantly felt empty. David looked around, visibly moved. Damn, you're actually serious, he said. I thought you were joking when you said you were canceling the wedding. I mean, I've watched you chasing after Willow all these years. What the hell happened? He tossed me a can of beer and opened one for himself. Maybe because I was about to leave soon, I suddenly felt the urge to talk. I told David everything that had happened over the past month, including the fact that Willow was already pregnant with Makoto's child. David had seen everything between us over the years. After hearing it all, he exploded. That's insane. After everything you did for her, she goes and cheats on you right before the wedding, and then has the nerve to expect you to go along with it. What the hell is wrong with her? I shook my head and let out a bitter laugh. I said, who knows? She said Makoto saved her life, and now she wants to fulfill all his wishes. David's face darkened. You saved her life too, so why the hell does she treat you like this? I took a sip of beer and didn't say another word. Maybe, she just didn't love me, but it's alright. Soon enough, I'll be gone from her life for good. Chapter 6. On the 5th day of the countdown, I submitted my resignation to the school. Back then, in order to be with Willow, I turned down my advisor's offer to continue doing research and chose instead to teach at a university. So when my colleagues heard I was leaving, they were all surprised. One of them asked, why are you quitting, Mr. Wong? Another teased, you just handed out wedding candy a few days ago. Are you leaving to become a full-time house husband? Your wife sure is lucky. I smiled as I held my boxes. I said, no, the wedding's been called off. As I opened the front door, I saw Willow and Makoto for the first time in a week. Willow glanced at the stuff in my arms and instinctively asked, why are you carrying all that? I casually came up with an excuse, just some things I don't use anymore. Figured I'd bring them back. Willow nodded, then looked around the apartment, puzzled. I was only gone a week, why does it feel like a lot of stuff is missing? I carried the box to the bedroom and replied calmly, I just cleared out some unnecessary junk. Willow opened her mouth to say more, but Makoto cut in. George, Willow's been traveling with me these past few days. She's been amazing. I also want to thank you for letting her take those wedding photos with me. It was a dream come true. Let me treat you both to dinner as a thank you. I might still have to rely on you two for a while, so I hope you won't mind too much. I could tell from the slightly provocative glint in his eyes that he was getting restless. After all, since the moment I found that ultrasound report, I hadn't said a word, not to Willow, not to anyone. I hadn't questioned her, hadn't made a scene, but I had no desire to engage in a meaningless rivalry with him. In 5 days, I'd be gone from Willow's life for good. Right now, I just wanted to wrap things up quietly. Seeing my silence, Makoto hesitated and said to Willow, Willow, is George upset? I mean, you two are getting married soon. But, Willow immediately frowned and snapped at me, clearly annoyed. Makoto is sincerely trying to thank us, and you're just sitting there with that attitude. It's just a meal, we're not poisoning you. You will come with us. And stop being so petty, you're a grown man. I hadn't said a single word, yet she'd already made me the villain. In the end, she dragged me along. At the restaurant, the waiter came over to take our order. I had just picked up the menu when Willow spoke first. Nothing too oily or spicy, and no cilantro in anything. When the dishes arrived, Willow attentively picked out food for Makoto and placed it in his bowl. Then she pushed a plate of prawns toward me. She said, Makoto can't eat seafood, so we ordered these just for you. Looking at the plate of prawns, I suddenly lost my appetite and set down my chopsticks. I said, I'm allergic to seafood. What a joke. We'd been together for 5 years, and Willow didn't know I was allergic to seafood. But she knew all of Makoto's dietary restrictions. She even remembered he didn't like cilantro. For a second, Willow looked genuinely confused, her expression blank. When she looked at me again, There was a rare flicker of guilt in her eyes. She added a few more dishes after that, but I didn't touch a single bite for the rest of the meal. I just quietly sipped my water. As we were walking down the steps outside, I got a call from my senior in the lab. She said, "George, Professor wants to double-check, you're going to follow the standard experiment schedule, right? The first phase involves a classified project. It's very likely you won't be able to contact the outside world for 1 to 2 years." My eyes landed on Willow and Makoto walking just ahead of me. They were side by side, and as they stepped down, Willow unconsciously placed a hand on her belly. My voice was calm and steady. "Yes," confirmed. My senior sighed in relief. "Good. The professor was worried you wouldn't be able to let go of your wife." I withdrew my gaze and turned to walk in the opposite direction. "The wedding's been cancelled," I said. "I'm ready to leave." Right as I finished speaking, a confused voice called out behind me. Willow asked, "Who's leaving?" Chapter 7. Just as Willow finished seeing Makoto off and closed the car door, she caught the last few words of my conversation. I realized she hadn't heard the beginning, so I casually made something up. I said, "It's just a friend of mine, he's leaving town soon." Willow nodded and didn't press further. On the 4th day of the countdown, Willow brought home the wedding photos she had taken with Makoto. She was on a video call with him, holding the phone in one hand and the framed photos in the other, smiling sweetly. "Makoto, our wedding photos are ready." When I went to pick them up, the staff said they turned out beautifully, she said, beaming. At that exact moment, I came out to get a glass of water. Willow's smile faltered slightly, a trace of awkwardness flashing in her eyes. She looked like she wanted to say something to me. I glanced at the photo and calmly said, "They do look nice." Willow was stunned. She suddenly realized I hadn't really spoken to her in a long time, not even a message during her week-long trip with Makoto. The silence felt unfamiliar to her. Makoto kept chatting away on the call, and she shook her head, brushing it off, thinking maybe I was just too exhausted from preparing the wedding. On the second-to-last day, I remembered that once I entered the lab, I'd have to bring everything I needed myself, including medication. So I went to the hospital to pick up some basic supplies. I didn't expect to run into Willow and Makoto, who had just come out from a prenatal checkup. Willow opened her mouth to say something, but Makoto beat her to it. He walked up to me and looked like he was about to kneel. "George, I know you haven't really accepted the fact that Willow is pregnant, but I can't wait any longer. The doctors say I might only have 1 year left. I want to be alive to see my child born," he said. "After the baby is born, I'll take them away right away. I swear I won't interfere in your relationship with Willow." Before I could respond, Willow quickly pulled him up, her face full of concern. "You're not well. You can't be doing this." Then she turned to me. "Since you already know, I won't hide it anymore," Willow said. "Don't worry. It's still early. This won't affect the wedding." A month ago, I might have been furious, devastated, crushed with self-doubt. I might have wondered what I did wrong, what made Willow willingly carry another man's child. But after everything that's happened, I finally understand. It's not that I wasn't good enough, it's that she never loved me, and because she didn't love me, she never cared how her choices would hurt me. Now that I already knew the truth and had let go of everything I felt for her, there was no need for them to keep playing this tragic little act, as if I were the villain tearing apart true love. I looked at them calmly and said, "I know." Then I took the medicine and turned to leave. I still had a few things to pack. My departure was just around the corner. They clearly hadn't expected me to be so composed. Especially Willow. She watched my retreating figure with a complicated expression. She remembered how I had reacted to the pregnancy rumor weeks ago, how it consumed me. But now that the truth was confirmed, I didn't even flinch. Strangely, that unsettled her. Just as I reached the stairs, Makoto suddenly caught up and grabbed my sleeve. Willow was still some distance behind. With no one else in earshot, Makoto finally dropped the act. He smirked and said, "George, how does it feel raising someone else's kid? Getting married while your wife is pregnant with another man's child, I swear. Only you could put up with that." I had no interest in engaging with him. I yanked my arm away and turned to go, but with just that one motion, his body tipped awkwardly, and he began to fall down the stairs. I instinctively grabbed his arm and stopped him from tumbling down. Before I could let go, a voice thundered behind me, full of fury. "What are you doing?" Willow had arrived, and Makoto instantly slipped back into his innocent persona. "Willow, I just wanted to thank George for being so understanding." I didn't think he would. Hearing that, Willow's face turned cold. "George, I can't believe you'd do something like this. You owe Makoto an apology, right now." Chapter 8. Hearing her blindly accuse me, I couldn't help but laugh out of sheer disbelief. I said, "Me, apologize? Why don't you go check the security footage and see for yourself who should really be apologizing, and who should be thanking me?" I hadn't expected Willow to completely take Makoto's side without even bothering to check the surveillance. She just assumed I had tried to push him down the stairs. Willow replied, Makoto is sick. Do you really think he'd purposely hurt himself? A flicker of panic flashed in Makoto's eyes. He said, let it go. Willow, George is just upset. It's normal for him to react like that. Let's just leave. But Willow wasn't done. She insisted. No, he has to apologize to you today. I stood my ground. I wasn't going to apologize for something I didn't do. Makoto started to get nervous. If this dragged on, Willow might really go check the footage. So he held his head and said he wasn't feeling well. Willow's furious expression immediately softened into concern. She rushed to support him and take him to a doctor. I watched their backs as they left, and a cold bitterness rose in my chest. Over 20 years of knowing each other, 5 years of living side by side, and yet Willow didn't have even a shred of trust in me. But it's fine. I was finally waking up, finally pulling myself out. The last day before I left, Willow didn't come home. I figured she was busy taking care of Makoto, who had fallen ill again. I had already sent my luggage ahead to the lab, keeping only a small backpack with me. That night, Willow finally returned. She still looked angry. She snapped. Makoto's still lying in the hospital. He's sick. Can't you just be the bigger person for once? Why do you have to be so petty? The bigger person. The kind of generosity she wanted, no man in the world could live up to that. Willow's eyes caught the big red circle on the calendar. Her expression eased a little. She said, all right, the wedding's tomorrow. I don't want to argue anymore. Once it's over, you can apologize to Makoto, and then we'll go on our honeymoon. I didn't respond. If Willow had been paying the slightest bit of attention, she would have noticed there were no wedding decorations anywhere in the house. I said, but before I could finish, her phone rang. Makoto's voice came through the speaker, and Willow immediately tensed. She said, wait for me, I'm coming. She hung up and stood to leave. Makoto's not feeling well. I'm going to check on him. I'll be back before the wedding. Wait for me in the morning. The door closed behind her, and only then did the words I had swallowed finally come out. I said, let's break up. Willow, the wedding's off. My voice echoed in the empty room. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. I sat in the living room from night until dawn, watching as darkness slowly gave way to morning light. My phone buzzed with a reminder. 3 hours until boarding. I stood up, walked into the bedroom, and grabbed my already packed backpack. Then I picked up a marker and drew a big X across the number 10, the day of the wedding, on the calendar. Beneath it, I wrote, Willow, let's break up. I placed the calendar where she would see it first, shouldering my backpack. I walked out the door and took a cab to the airport. Goodbye, Willow. Chapter 9. On the other side of town, Willow didn't leave the hospital until Makoto's condition had stabilized. As she walked along the street, she sent George a message asking if everything was ready for the wedding. She was already on her way to the hotel, but even after getting in the car, she still hadn't received a reply. She opened her phone, ready to message him again, only to realize their last conversation was from over 2 weeks ago. Willow scrolled up through their chat history. Nearly the entire screen was filled with George's white message bubbles. Sometimes he asked what she wanted for dinner. Sometimes he was confirming wedding details with her. Her replies, every time, were brief. Whatever. Up to you. You decide. But George never seemed to mind. He still messaged her every day, until these past 2 weeks, when there had been complete silence between them. A strange feeling passed through Willow's chest. Why hadn't he messaged her for so long? That thought triggered a memory, one from a month ago, when she told George she was going to get pregnant with Makoto's child through artificial insemination. That was the first time in 20 years she had seen such pain in his eyes. The first time he had ever shown such strong objection to anything she said. And yet, after that, the only thing he firmly opposed was the artificial insemination. In all other things, he behaved just the same as before. But now that she thought about it, it was probably right after that last conversation, when she told him again she was going to carry Makoto's child, that their communication completely stopped. George didn't just stop messaging her. Even when she was at home, he barely spoke to her. The more Willow remembered, the more uneasy she became. Her heart began to pound, as if something terrible was about to happen. She tried to calm herself, telling herself George was probably just overwhelmed with wedding preparations. At the same time, she told the driver to speed up. Willow checked her phone again, still no reply. Her grip on the phone tightened involuntarily. When she finally arrived at the hotel, several of her friends and family members were already there. They were huddled together discussing something, but when they saw her, they immediately came over. Mrs. Liu frowned as she looked at her daughter rushing in and asked, Willow, why aren't you wearing your wedding dress? And where's George? Didn't he come with you? A friend glanced around, also confused. Yeah, where's the groom? You haven't even changed into your dress yet. Hearing that they hadn't seen George either, a wave of panic surged in Willow's chest. She had clearly told him the night before to go straight to the venue in the morning. So where was he now? Had he gone to the banquet hall first? Willow forced a smile and said, George is probably already inside the hall checking on everything. She turned to head toward the hall, but then suddenly realized she didn't know which banquet hall it was. George had never told her, and she had never asked. The people around her had no idea either, otherwise, they wouldn't still be waiting in the hotel lobby. Willow quickly grabbed a nearby staff member and asked, "Excuse me, could you tell me which hall Mr. George reserved for the wedding?" The staff member flipped through the reservation log and replied politely, "Mr. George booked hall No. 3. Willow exhaled slightly, unconsciously relieved. So she had overthought it. He'd just been busy lately. She even thought that maybe during their honeymoon, she'd surprise George for once, buy him a gift to thank him for everything he did to prepare this wedding. But in the very next second, the staff member paused and looked at the last note in the reservation column. With a puzzled expression, he added, "But Mr. Wang called us more than 2 weeks ago to cancel the reservation. He said, the wedding has been canceled." His words struck everyone like a hammer to the chest. Willow's mind went completely blank. What do you mean, the wedding has been cancelled? Chapter 10. Willow took a step back, shaking her head in disbelief. How could the wedding be cancelled? Just 2 months ago, when he proposed, the joy on his face was so obvious, he couldn't even hide it. How could someone like that suddenly decide to call everything off? The friends and family around her were equally confused. They hadn't gotten the date wrong. Why would anyone say the wedding was cancelled? After the hotel staff confirmed, again and again, that it had indeed been George who called to cancel, Mrs. Liu, trying to hold back her anger, pulled Willow aside and asked, "What's going on with George? Didn't you two settle on the wedding date a long time ago? Not only is he not here today, he cancelled the wedding. What does that even mean?" Looking at her daughter's stunned expression, clearly just as shocked, Mrs. Liu felt her anger rise even higher. She had known George and Willow had been close for 20 years. She could see how deeply George cared for Willow, which is why she had trusted him with her daughter. But now, on the very day of the wedding, not only was George missing, he had cancelled it 2 weeks ago, and none of them had any idea. Mrs. Liu snapped. "Call him right now. Ask him if he even still wants to get married." It was only then, as if suddenly waking from a dream, that Willow pulled out her phone and dialed George's number. Her hand trembled slightly as she held the phone to her ear, but by that time, George was already on a flight heading to the capital. The call didn't even connect. All she heard was the cold, mechanical voice from the operator. A heavy sense of dread settled over Willow's heart. Everything had been fine just yesterday, so why was he suddenly unreachable today? Panic surged in her chest, and she couldn't hold back anymore. She rushed back home, clinging to one final shred of hope. But when she opened the front door, the house was silent. Clearly, George wasn't there. Then she suddenly noticed the photo frame that had always sat on the table was gone. Inside had been one of the few photos of her and George together. He had always cherished that picture, kept the frame spotless every day. And now, it was missing. Not only that, the razor in the bathroom, the clothes in the wardrobe, everything that belonged to George was gone, completely vanished. Willow's mind flashed back to when she and Makoto had just returned from their trip. She remembered thinking the place felt emptier than usual. She'd noticed the missing photo frame then too, but she had only vaguely sensed something was off. When George told her he had cleared out some unnecessary stuff, she hadn't questioned it, but now she realized, George hadn't just cleared out unnecessary things. He had cleared out everything, every last belonging of his, and every memory they'd shared, and now, even he was gone. There was only confusion left in Willow's eyes. Where had he gone? And why would he do this? She looked around the apartment again, still unwilling to give up, and spotted the calendar on the table. It looked like something had been written on it. She quickly stepped over and picked it up. There, written in thick black marker, were just a few words. "Let's break up." Chapter 11. In that instant, Willow felt as if lightning had struck her. The suspicion that had quietly lingered in the back of her mind was finally confirmed. George was really breaking up with her. But why? They were supposed to get married today. Willow knew this was something George had dreamed about for 20 years. How could he possibly give it up? In the whirlwind of thoughts, her mind flashed back to George's overly calm expression before she left the house. He had looked like he wanted to say something, but she had been in such a rush to get to the hospital to see Makoto. She hadn't stayed long enough to hear him out. Just before the door closed, she had caught a glimpse of him sitting on the sofa, no joy on his face for the upcoming wedding, no anger over her running off to see Makoto on the eve of it, just stillness, like water without a ripple. So that's what he had wanted to say last night, that he was breaking up with her. Willow collapsed onto the sofa, her thoughts an uncontrollable mess. The phone on the coffee table kept ringing, calls from her parents, from friends, but she didn't have the energy to answer a single one. She just couldn't understand why George wanted to break up with her. According to the hotel staff, he had cancelled the wedding 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago. Suddenly, Willow remembered, that was when she got confirmation from the hospital that the artificial insemination had been successful. She had planned to bring it up again that day and convince George to support her decision. But when the hospital informed her she was already pregnant, excitement took over and she rushed out the door, dropping the topic completely. Now, the memories of the past 2 weeks came into focus. Canceling the wedding photos, going on a trip with Makoto. George had stayed so calm through it all, detached even. If it had been the old him, he would have fought her on every single decision. Willow felt a sudden panic and confusion. So, he had already planned to leave back then. But didn't he understand? Makoto had saved her life. Everything she was doing was just to repay a debt. Why couldn't George understand that? She had kept the artificial insemination a secret not to betray him, but because she thought it wouldn't succeed so easily. If she waited to get George's consent, Makoto might not live long enough to see his child born. So she went ahead with the first procedure, believing she'd have time to explain, to convince George slowly. She believed he loved her enough to eventually accept it, but she hadn't expected it to work on the very first try. It had thrown her entire plan off. Still, when George found out at the hospital, he didn't seem to react that strongly. He never brought it up again. So why now? Why break up right before the wedding? What Willow didn't know was that George had known about the pregnancy long before she said a word, and the breakup wasn't a sudden decision. It had been quietly taking root in his heart for 2 weeks. In that time, he had burned through every last drop of love he'd carried for Willow over 20 years. Unwilling to accept it, Willow picked up her phone again and dialed his number. But as soon as the call connected, her panic was replaced by a surge of anger. On the other end, 2 hours later, I landed in the capital. Before takeoff, my senior had texted me, saying she was worried I might not find the place, so she'd arranged someone to pick me up. There were a lot of people waiting at arrivals. I scanned the crowd several times but didn't see anyone holding a sign with my name. I was about to take out my phone and call when I heard a cheerful voice behind me. Senior. I turned around to see a girl walking toward me with a sweet, glowing smile. Sorry, do I know you? I asked. She looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place her. She shot me a playful glare, her voice brimming with joy. Come on, senior. It's only been 5 years and you've already forgotten your junior. Should I go report you to the professor? Suddenly, the image of a tearful girl from 5 years ago came flooding back to me. You're Anna, I said, surprised. Back then, when I was about to graduate, the professor had just taken in a new student named Anna. I'd been busy with my thesis and didn't interact with her much, but I remembered one thing. Her experiment data had been a mess, and she couldn't figure out where she went wrong. I happened to be at the lab picking something up and noticed her red eyes as I passed by. I asked if she needed help, and after carefully going through her process step by step, we finally found the problem. And now, 5 years later, the once quiet, teary-eyed girl had changed so much that I hadn't recognized her at all. Anna walked up naturally and led the way, teasing. So you do remember me after all. I thought you'd completely erased me from your memory. I rubbed the tip of my nose. After spending years with someone like Willow, who was always cold and distant, I found myself unsure how to deal with Anna's warmth. But she didn't seem to mind at all. Seeing me walk so slowly, she immediately came back, grabbed my arm, and pulled me along. Come on, senior. The professor has been waiting forever for you. We sped toward the lab. When we finally stood outside the professor's office, I hesitated. I didn't dare knock. Back when I was about to graduate, my professor had begged me to stay and continue my research. But at the time, Willow had just agreed to be my girlfriend. My whole world was filled with her. So I declined and followed her to become a teacher. The professor tried again later. When the lab launched a new project, he spent a long time trying to convince me over the phone. But I'd been with Willow for 5 years by then. I couldn't bear the thought of leaving her. So I turned him down again. That phone call really upset him. Even 2 weeks ago, it was my senior who called me. I had been too afraid the professor was still angry at me. Anna watched me hesitate, her eyes darting mischievously. She decided to help. The next second, she raised her voice and shouted toward the office door. Professor, he's back. My eyes widened, and I instinctively reached out to cover her mouth. Before Anna could finish, my hand was already pressed against her lips. Soft, warm. We both froze. I pulled my hand back like I'd touched something scalding. Anna turned her head away, a little flustered. The tips of her ears turned red. I didn't know what to do, until a familiar voice came from inside the office. Well, what are you waiting for? Get in here. Chapter 12. I didn't have time to think too much. I quickly pulled myself together, took a deep breath, and pushed open the door. It had been 5 years since we last met, and the first thing I noticed was the strands of gray now visible in my professor's hair. The guilt in my heart surged again as I remembered how I had left him, despite his repeated attempts to get me to stay, all because I'd chosen to follow Willow. The professor looked at me, his most promising, yet most disappointing student, and all the words he might have said turned into a single sigh. This time, stay and work hard in the lab, he said. I swallowed the emotion rising in my throat and nodded firmly. He didn't say anything more, just waved his hand and told Anna to show me to my dorm. As soon as I got to the room, I dropped my backpack and flopped onto the bed, letting out a deep sigh of relief. I had barely slept since last night, only caught a couple of hours of rest on the plane. The exhaustion hit me all at once as soon as I lay down. Without even unpacking, I fell asleep almost instantly, but just as I was deep in sleep, my phone started ringing. I groaned, blindly fumbling for my phone, my brain still foggy with sleep. I answered purely out of reflex. On the other end, Willow's voice exploded into my ear, laced with anger. George, where the hell did you go? The sheer volume of her voice snapped me fully awake. I looked at the time. I'd only just fallen asleep. Between the jarring wake-up and the fatigue from traveling, I couldn't help the irritation in my tone. I already wrote it clearly on the calendar. I said, we broke up. The moment I said that, her anger only intensified. She still didn't understand. No, she snapped. I didn't agree to it. And even if you want to break up, don't you owe me an explanation? You just disappeared on our wedding day, left me with a note saying we're done. What is that supposed to mean? If you listen closely, there was a hint of something else in her voice, something soft, something hurt, because Willow had never once imagined she and George would actually break up, even less so that she'd be left at the altar. George had been by her side for 20 years. How could he just walk away? But all I wanted right now was to go back to sleep. I had no interest in dragging this out. I said, you're pregnant with Makoto's child. Do you really think I'd marry a woman carrying another man's baby? And besides, I finally realized something. You never loved me. The line went quiet for a long moment. I was already starting to drift off again when Willow's hoarse voice finally came through. So you're breaking up with me because of the baby? I didn't respond. The truth was, her pregnancy was only the spark, what ignited a love that had already been hanging by a thread. Watching her over the past few months with Makoto, I finally saw that she could be gentle, attentive, even devoted, and I realized, for the first time, she was never like that with me, because she didn't love me. That was the real reason I was walking away. Willow spoke again. I don't agree to breaking up. Tell me where you are. I want to see you. But I had no intention of seeing her again. Breaking up isn't like getting married. It doesn't require two people to say yes. When even one person walks away, the relationship is over. And I believe a proper ex should be like the dead, completely gone from the other person's life. There was no need for me and Willow to ever meet again. So I said flatly, there's no point. Let's end things peacefully. Leave each other some dignity. Before she could respond, I hung up the phone. Then I opened the call log and added Willow's number to the block list. When I opened WeChat, I realized she had also sent dozens of messages. At first, she had been asking about the wedding. Then, realizing I was gone, she had started asking where I went, again and again. In one day, she had sent more messages than she had in the entire past month. I skimmed through them briefly, then blocked her there as well. After that, I tossed my phone aside, pulled the blanket over my head, and went back to sleep. Chapter 13. When the call was abruptly cut off, Willow froze for a moment. It was the first time George had ever hung up on her, and he hadn't even explained anything. Why end the call like that? She didn't even know where he had gone. Willow quickly redialed, but the line only returned a cold, robotic message. Sorry, the number you have dialed is currently unavailable. Please try again later. She tried sending him a message instead, but the second it went out, a red exclamation mark popped up. Message sent but rejected by the recipient. Willow's mind went completely blank. He had blocked her. George had gotten upset before, sure, but he had never blocked her. Panic overtook her, followed quickly by a wave of anger. It really was because of the baby. But she had explained it so many times. Makoto had cancer. He had saved her life. Of course she wanted to help him fulfill his last wish. Why couldn't George just understand that? Still, beneath the anger was something worse, fear. She had never imagined breaking up with George. Now not only did she not know where he was, she had no way to contact him. In desperation, Willow thought of David, George's close friend. She'd only met him once, during a gathering where George had brought her along to David's place. She retraced the route from memory and rushed over. When David opened the door, he found Willow standing there, clearly flustered and out of breath. David had always thought it was unfair how much his best friend chased after Willow while receiving so little in return. But since they were dating, he hadn't said anything back then, after George told him the real reason for the cancelled wedding. However, David's tolerance had reached its limit. He couldn't understand how someone could be so ungrateful. Seeing Willow now on his doorstep, all of that frustration finally spilled out. He sneered and said, well, if it isn't the fiancée turned baby mama of my dear friend, what brings you here? Willow froze. David knew about the pregnancy. But she had no time to worry about that. All she cared about now was finding George. Where did George go? She asked directly. David rolled his eyes. When George was by her side every day, she barely gave him the time of day. Now that he was gone, she suddenly cared. I don't know, he snapped. He started to close the door, but Willow reflexively reached out to stop it. David didn't react in time, and the door slammed into her hand. Pain shot through her fingers, and her eyes instantly welled up with tears from the sharp, physical ache, cradling her hand. She bit her lip and forced herself to hold back the pain. I need to know where he went, she insisted. David cursed under his breath. He truly couldn't wrap his head around her. You're having another man's baby, he said coldly. Why the hell do you care where George went? That hit hard, and suddenly, everything made sense to Willow. Even George's friends disapproved of the pregnancy, but she had reasons. And besides, she hadn't even done anything with Makoto physically. She repeated the explanation she had given George so many times before. Makoto saved my life. I'm only helping him have a child to repay him. That's all, there's nothing else. Just tell me where George is. I want to explain. David listened with a smirk forming on his face, then scoffed. You want his address? Keep dreaming. I'm not letting you mess with him again. George saved your life too, why don't you ever try repaying him? Willow was stunned. George saved her life. What was he talking about? She had no memory of that, none at all. She asked, what do you mean? When did George ever save me? Chapter 14. David hadn't expected her to forget something so important. The realization only deepened his sense of injustice for his friend, and his disgust toward the woman standing in front of him grew even stronger. He let out a cold laugh. Wow. Must be nice to have such a selective memory. You really forgot what happened that New Year's Eve 6 years ago. You didn't even thank him back then, and now you treat him like this. The more David spoke, the more his anger built up. He poured out everything, how George had silently given 20 years of his life for Willow, and what really happened on that terrifying night 6 years ago. He even pulled out his phone and showed her the photo of George lying unconscious in a hospital bed after surgery. Willow didn't know how she made it out of David's house. Her mind had gone blank, her thoughts spiraling. It felt like her world had collapsed around her, like she was falling into a darkness where no light could reach her. In her memory, it had always been Makoto who saved her that night. How could it have been George? But if what David said was true, if it was George who had saved her, then she had been wrong about everything. All these years. Even worse. Her hand trembled as it slowly moved to rest on her belly. Even this child should never have existed. Willow immediately hailed a cab and rushed to the hospital. She had to know the truth. Was it really Makoto who saved her that night? Sitting in the cab, she tried to piece everything together. She remembered walking back to the dorm when she realized someone was following her. That man had grabbed her, covered her mouth and nose, and dragged her into an alley. His hands had been all over her, and there was a knife pressed against her back. All she had felt was pure, paralyzing fear. She thought she wouldn't live to see the morning, but just when she thought it was over, a shadow had charged in, tackling the attacker to the ground. She had curled up in a corner, trembling uncontrollably. She tried to call the police but passed out from the shock before she could do anything. When she woke up, the first person she saw was Makoto. Naturally, she had assumed it was him who saved her, but according to David, it had been George all along. George had been stabbed during the rescue. He'd spent 3 days unconscious in the hospital. By the time he woke up, she had already been discharged, and George never told her the truth, not once in 6 years. He didn't want her to feel indebted to him. More than that, he was afraid it would bring back the trauma of that night. The more she thought about it, the more Willow began to panic. If George was the one who saved her, what had she done? What kind of person had she become? When she finally arrived at the hospital, Makoto looked surprised to see her. Willow, I thought today was your wedding with George, he said. His eyes widened when he saw the red mark on her hand. What happened to your hand? I'll get a doctor. Willow stopped him. No need, she said calmly. Then she looked him dead in the eyes. Makoto, are you really the one who saved my life that night? She stared at him, not missing a single flicker of emotion. Makoto clearly hadn't expected the question. A flash of panic crossed his eyes, but it vanished quickly as he forced himself to remain composed. Of course I was, he said. You saw me when you woke up, didn't you? Don't you remember? He said it with complete confidence, but Willow had been watching him closely. She didn't miss that moment of hesitation, of guilt, before he collected himself. Her heart sank. Makoto was not the one who saved her. Chapter 15. Willow closed her eyes. Her heart felt as if it had been torn apart by the truth she had just uncovered. Makoto, she said quietly, you're not the one who saved me 6 years ago. Makoto's eyes widened. Panic flickered inside him. Hadn't it been accepted all along that he was her savior? Why was Willow bringing it up again now, and denying it? Still, he kept his face calm. managing a gentle smile as he reached for her hand. "Willow, what are you talking about?" he said softly, but the confusion, the guilt, and the grief that had built inside Willow since George's disappearance suddenly crashed down on her all at once. She slapped Makoto's hand away and, eyes red, yelled at him. "It was George. The one who saved me was George, the man who's been by my side for 20 years. Stop lying. I've already seen the proof. Why did you lie to me?" Seeing her fall apart like this, Makoto realized there was no point in hiding anymore. Back then, he had just been visiting a friend at the hospital. When he passed by Willow's bed, he noticed her face and paused, just in time to see her wake up. She had mistaken him for her savior, and Makoto hadn't corrected her. He had intended to get close to her using that identity, but unexpectedly, his family sent him abroad, and they lost contact. It wasn't until 6 months ago, after his cancer diagnosis, that he returned and reached out to Willow again. Makoto hurried to explain. "Willow, I only used it as an excuse to get closer to you." But Willow was already consumed by despair. She no longer cared why he had lied. All she wanted was to draw a clear line between them and make things right. Word by word, she said firmly, "I'm going to terminate the pregnancy." Makoto panicked. This child was the last legacy he could leave his family. She couldn't just get rid of it. "No," he cried. "That baby is alive now. You're its mother. How can you just give it up? And besides, George already knew about the pregnancy 2 weeks ago, didn't he? I bet the wedding was called off by now. Wouldn't it be better for you to give birth to my child and become the daughter-in-law of the Ito family?" Willow froze at that last sentence. 2 weeks ago. A wave of sorrow surged from her chest and flooded her entire body. Tears rolled down her cheeks without pause. So George had known about her pregnancy all along. That's why he left that day. That's why he had been so calm for the past 2 weeks. That's why, when they met at the hospital, he didn't even look surprised. And she hadn't seen any of it. Every time she thought of how deeply she had hurt him, for the sake of a man who wasn't even her real savior, her chest ached like it had been slashed open. She wiped her tears away, and in her eyes was a clarity she had never had before. She would terminate the pregnancy. She would find George. She would apologize. And she would make up for every bit of love he had ever given her over the last 20 years. Seeing that she was about to leave, Makoto forgot all about his illness and tried to stop her. "Willow," he called after her. "After everything we've been through these past 6 months, are you telling me you don't feel anything for me?" But in Willow's mind now, there was only one person. George, the boy who used to quietly follow her at a distance during their school days. The man who made her warm brown sugar ginger tea when she had cramps. The one who loved her for 20 years without ever wavering. She couldn't deny it anymore. At first, she had only agreed to date George out of curiosity. She had wanted to know whether someone could really stay in love for so long. Back then, she hadn't given him much of her heart, but after 5 years of living side by side, she came to feel his care, his thoughtfulness, and she finally realized, there really was someone in the world who could love another person, unchanged. For 20 years, she now understood. She had already fallen in love with George long ago, without even knowing it. When she looked at Makoto again, all she felt was coldness and distance. "I never did," she said, "and from now on, I won't be in contact with you again." Chapter 16. Willow scheduled the surgery that very day to terminate the pregnancy. When the Ito family found out, they stormed into the hospital, yelling that the doctors had killed their only heir. But Willow's signature was there in black and white. The hospital called the police, who escorted the Ito family out for disturbing public order. Willow didn't pay attention to anything related to the Ito family anymore. She refused to accept losing George without a trace, so she returned to David's place to ask where he had gone. When he wouldn't answer the first time, she started waiting outside his door every single day. After several days of this, David finally gave in, just a little. "He's gone to a lab," he said, annoyed. "Left City A already. That's all I'm telling you." No matter how much Willow pressed, David wouldn't say another word about which lab it was. But she and George had gone to the same university, so she started asking around among old classmates, and eventually learned that George's mentor had founded a new lab in the capital. There was no concrete proof George was working there, but something in her heart told her he was there. Willow bought a ticket and flew straight to the capital. With the address her classmates had given her, she managed to find the lab. The first round of experiments hadn't started yet, so the facility wasn't under full lockdown. Willow found someone who had just come back from outside and asked if they could help her look for George. When George heard from his senior that someone was asking for him, he was surprised. He had only given his location to a few people. Who could possibly have found him so soon after he left City A? He walked out with a puzzled look, and froze when he saw who it was. Willow. The moment she saw him, her eyes welled up with tears. The fear and uncertainty she'd been holding inside finally collapsed into something solid. She rushed forward and grabbed his hand tightly. "Why did you break up with me?" Why did you leave without saying anything? Do you have any idea how hard it was to find you?" George was still in shock from seeing her, and her questions only left him more stunned. He didn't pull his hand away immediately. Willow noticed his lack of resistance and felt a flicker of hope. Maybe George was just angry, maybe once she explained everything, he would forgive her, but her hopeful fantasy shattered in the very next second. George came to his senses and instantly pulled his hand away, his expression turning cold. "What are you doing here?" he asked, clearly impatient. Willow panicked at his reaction. "I came to apologize," she said quickly. George cut her off. "I don't want to hear it. My answer has never changed. We're over. I don't know how you found this place, but don't come looking for me again. The experiment starts tomorrow, and I just want to focus on my work. You should go back. Makoto's probably waiting for you." Willow knew that her past attitude had hurt George deeply, and that's why he was being so cold now. But she was willing to use all the time she had to make it up to him. "George, I don't feel anything for Makoto," she said. "The person I love is you." In 5 years together, this was the first time George had ever heard Willow say the word love, but those 5 years had been empty of joy. His heart had long since sobered. He didn't believe in a word of it anymore. He gave her a sharp look, full of sarcasm. "You don't find it ridiculous to say that now?" And with that, he turned and walked back into the lab, unwilling to speak further. Willow called his name over and over, but George never looked back. She found a hotel near the lab and checked in. She thought, he can't stay inside forever. I'll see him again. But a day passed, then 2, then a week. Still no sign of George. Unable to wait anymore, she asked one of the security guards, only to learn that the experiment had already begun. No one would be allowed out until it was complete. "How long will the experiment take?" she asked urgently. The guard replied, "Estimated duration, 18 months. Willow flew back to City A in a daze. When she got home, she lay down on the bed they had shared for 5 years. But the house, once so familiar, now felt unbearably cold. There would be no one to bring her water or medicine when she was sick, no one to call her name, or leave a light on when she came home late. Willow curled into a ball, as if trying to create some warmth for herself. At some point, she fell asleep, and in her dreams, it was as if the past week had never happened. She and George had their wedding as planned. The next day, they got their marriage certificate, officially becoming husband and wife. Then they traveled through Europe on their honeymoon, taking photos together at every destination. When Willow woke up, she didn't know if what she had seen was a dream or reality. She instinctively called out George's name, but there was no familiar voice replying, only the sound of sparrows chirping outside the window. She reached for her pillow and found it soaked in tears. George's cold, decisive rejection, the truth about her mistaken savior, they played over and over in her mind, leaving her in a fog of helplessness. But when her eyes landed on the calendar, and the bright red word breakup marked on it, her thoughts finally cleared. She didn't want to break up with George, even if he was going to be locked inside the lab for a year and a half. She would wait. For the past 20 years, it had always been George chasing after her. Now, it was her turn to chase after him. This time, she would be the one to prove her love. Willow's eyes grew firm. She would wait for George to come back. Chapter 17. 2 years later, at the airport in City A, pushing my luggage with a smile on my face, I followed the figure skipping ahead of me, occasionally turning my head to take in the changes around me. I never imagined that our first experiment in the lab would take a full 2 years, but fortunately, the results were perfect, and the professor granted us 2 months of vacation. Finally, I had set foot again in City A. For a moment, I felt a wave of nostalgia. It had been 2 years since I left this city, but this time, when my gaze fell on Anna, who was excitedly hopping in front of me, my expression softened. The difference was that 2 years ago, I left alone, and today, I had returned with someone. More than that, we had something important to do this time. Anna turned around to make sure I was still following, then ran back and gave me a playful push on the back. She said, "Senior, if we don't hurry, we're going to be late." When David found out I was returning to City A, he didn't hesitate for a second and immediately planned a welcome dinner. After 2 years without seeing my friends, it was finally time to reunite. I had missed them deeply, so I agreed. The dinner was scheduled for the same day we arrived. By the time we got to the restaurant, it was already the appointed time. Anna grabbed my hand, and we rushed in almost running. I don't know if it was an illusion, but as we went up the stairs, I thought I saw a familiar silhouette. I didn't think much of it. We were in a hurry. After all, the most important thing was to find the private room. Elsewhere, Willow covered her mouth with her hand. Her eyes filled with tears, overwhelmed with emotion at recovering something she thought she had lost. 2 years had passed. She had waited a full 2 years, and finally, she had seen George again. No one knew how she had spent those endless nights alone in that empty apartment. At first, She couldn't sleep. Even when she did manage to doze off for a bit, the first thing she did upon waking was call out George's name. But the only response she ever got was absolute silence. There was no one to make her breakfast anymore. No one waiting for her to come home. She searched every corner of the apartment and couldn't find a single belonging of George's. Even the couple's pajamas had vanished. All she had left was the calendar on her nightstand. Although the last thing written on it was the breakup notice, it was still the only thing he had left behind. And deep down, she believed that as long as she didn't accept it, the breakup wasn't real. She thought that if she could see him again, if she could explain everything sincerely, tell him that she had mistaken her savior, that she had completely ended things with Makoto, and had even gotten an abortion. After 20 years together, George couldn't possibly give up so easily. She had always waited for his return, just to tell him everything she'd kept buried, and then, maybe, they could be together again. Now, 2 years later, fate had finally given her a chance, but remembering the girl who had been by George's side just now, Willow felt a sting of jealousy. They seemed very close. However, she had heard the girl call him senior. George had joined his professor's lab 2 years ago, so that girl was probably just a lab partner. With that thought, Willow calmed herself a little. Seeing them enter the restaurant, she followed behind. The moment Anna and I opened the door to the private room, there was a loud pop, and thousands of streamers flew through the air, showering down on us. David came over laughing and gave me a friendly smack on the shoulder. He said, 2 years without a single letter. If I hadn't known you were in the lab, I would have reported you missing to the police. Everyone in the room burst into laughter, joking non-stop. Someone chimed in. It's true, 2 years ago, you canceled your wedding and then disappeared. If it weren't for David, we wouldn't have known anything. That's so messed up, men. Another added. Exactly, you didn't say a word to anyone, and now you're late to your own welcome dinner. That calls for a punishment. Drink. Yeah, no one's going home sober tonight. Let's drink till we drop. Anna looked a little nervous. It was her first time meeting my friends, and she was worried they wouldn't accept her. I noticed her unease and discreetly took her hand. When our eyes met, she felt much calmer. Seeing my friends genuinely happy about my return filled me with emotion. But now, it was time to introduce Anna. I cleared my throat, raised our joined hands, and said loudly, now that I'm back, I want to introduce my lab partner, Anna. I paused and continued. She's also my fiancée. After everything that happened with Willow, I didn't think I'd ever fall in love again. I was even ready to dedicate myself solely to research, but I never imagined that in these 2 years, my lab partner Anna would gradually win over my heart. Anna and Willow couldn't have been more different. If Willow was a stone that never warmed, Anna was a little sun radiating constant warmth. With Anna, I understood for the first time what it truly meant to love, to be genuinely in love. So 2 months ago, on our 1-year anniversary, I proposed to her. We agreed to get married once the experiment was over. My friends exchanged glances and instantly erupted in cheers. Someone shouted, "You sly dog," saying you were working on experiments, but you were actually falling in love. Huh? Another said, "Fiancé, so when's the wedding? I'm calling dibs on being your best man." Me too. The cheerful atmosphere helped Anna completely relax. I smiled, just about to announce the wedding date, when a trembling voice sounded behind me. A woman asked, "She's your fiancé, then what am I?" Chapter 18. Before walking into the private room, Willow had even stopped by the restroom to fix her makeup in front of the mirror. She hadn't expected to run into George today. Originally, she'd just come here for a meal, but once she knew where he was, she couldn't wait for that next time. After quickly pulling herself together, she made her way to the door. She had imagined how George might react. Maybe he'd still be mad, unwilling to forgive her, or maybe he'd already moved on, and saw her as just an old acquaintance. Whatever the case, she thought she could accept it, as long as she could see him again. She believed she could bring back his feelings for her, but what she hadn't anticipated was hearing the word fiancé. It was as if someone had poured a bucket of ice water over her head. She froze from the crown of her head to the tips of her toes. It felt like her heart had been seized by a giant hand, squeezing so tight she couldn't breathe. She wanted desperately for George to say it was a joke, that Anna was just a junior colleague, but he didn't. Inside the room, his friends had already moved from joking about being groomsmen to arguing over who would be the godfather of George's future child. She couldn't hold it in anymore. With those thoughts swirling in her head, Willow pushed open the door. Her eyes locked immediately on George and Anna's intertwined hands. The warmth and closeness between them was unmistakable. It made Willow's breath catch in her throat, but I didn't care what she thought in that moment. To me, she was just a familiar stranger, someone from my past. 2 years ago, we had already broken up. I'd made myself clear. Yet now, here she was, ruining what should have been a joyful reunion. And that sentence she had just shouted, what was she trying to say? I frowned at her. clearly irritated. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "We broke up 2 years ago." Feeling Anna's slight squeeze on my palm, I looked down and saw her puffed-up cheeks. I couldn't help but smile, tightening my grip on her hand. Clearly, I'd need to do a little coaxing later. Anna had sensed Willow's intense gaze almost immediately, but she wasn't someone who shrank away. She simply shifted, wrapping both arms around mine in a subtle show of ownership. David, who had been quietly watching from the side, finally stepped forward with a cold expression. "Willow," he said, "you're the one who chose that sickly guy 2 years ago. Why are you looking for my bro now?" But Willow seemed not to hear a thing. Her eyes were glued to me. "George, this isn't real, right?" she asked. "You're just doing this to make me jealous, right?" Chapter 19. I almost laughed from how absurd her words were. Not real. Did she seriously think I'd go so far as to hire someone just to spite her? I didn't care what she believed. Still, part of me was confused. Back when we were together, Willow had always been distant. No matter how much I did for her, her attitude never changed. There were times I wondered if her heart was made of stone. Nothing I did ever seemed to reach her. Then Makoto came along, and suddenly, I saw a side of her I had never witnessed. Soft, gentle, attentive. That was when I realized, it wasn't that she couldn't love, she just didn't love me. That's why I let go. I stepped aside so she could be with him. So why was she now acting like she couldn't forget me? Even if Makoto had passed away from cancer, that didn't explain her current behavior. I said clearly, word by word, "Sorry, Anna is the woman I actually proposed to. Our wedding is on the 18th of this month, 10 days from now." Willow's eyes instantly filled with tears. She couldn't accept it. She couldn't accept that the man she loved was about to marry someone else. But I had no interest in rehashing old drama. I didn't want one irrelevant person to ruin my celebration tonight. I motioned to my friends to change locations. As I passed Willow, she instinctively reached out and grabbed the hem of my shirt, but there was no warmth left in my heart for her. I pulled away without hesitation, wrapped my arm around Anna, and walked out. Willow stood frozen, watching us leave. In the car, Anna quickly let go of my arm and crossed hers, scooting away from me slightly with a little huff. I chuckled. So this was what it felt like, to have someone get jealous over me. Back when I was with Willow, she'd always been indifferent. There was a time I tried to make her jealous. I asked a girl to pretend we were close, going to work and meals together, even posting ambiguous tweets. I waited and waited for Willow to confront me, but after a week, she didn't say a word. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I asked her directly if she'd seen me with someone else. Her response? Just a glance. Then, "I don't care." Those words branded themselves into me. They carved a hole in my heart. And now, just seeing my ex again made Anna visibly upset. Maybe this was what it meant to truly love, or not. Pulling myself out of my thoughts, I gently pulled Anna into my arms, placing my hand over hers. "Don't be mad," I said softly. "You're going to be a bride soon. Don't let anger make you less beautiful." Anna's face turned red in an instant. She glared at me playfully. "Are you saying I'm not beautiful now?" I quickly raised my hands in surrender. No, I said, grinning. "My junior is the most beautiful woman in the world." Laughter burst from the front seat. David and the others were clearly enjoying the moment. "Damn," one of them said. "Never thought I'd see you like this. Should have filmed it." We all went to a new place and partied until we were completely satisfied. Afterward, I took Anna home. Her family hadn't seen her in 2 years, and with the wedding so close, she'd want time with them. Once I saw her safely inside, I went back to my place. I didn't expect to find Willow sitting on the couch when I opened the door. Chapter 20. My parents were sitting nearby, clearly uneasy. 2 years ago, when I told them I was canceling the wedding, I never explained the real reason. I had only said I was focusing on research. So in their minds, the breakup had mostly been our family's decision. Even though they had always sensed that Willow's feelings for me were lukewarm at best, they still felt that we owed her something. Over the past 2 years, even while I was away, Willow had often shown up around our apartment complex. She never came upstairs or knocked, but my parents could tell she was looking for me. And in the last 6 months, her visits had become more frequent, nearly every other day. My parents had tried to gently discourage her. They reminded her that I had been firm in my decision, and that I wasn't even in the city anymore. Waiting around wouldn't change anything, but even so, they couldn't deny what they saw. Her persistence left a deep impression on them. Their image of her, once cold and distant, had started to soften. They'd even talked in private, wondering if they should convince me to give her another chance the next time I came home. After all, 5 years together and just one step from marriage, it wasn't something easily erased. But to their surprise, when they finally got news that I was coming back, they also learned that I was engaged and planning to get married soon. The guilt weighed heavily on them. They felt they had wronged Willow. So when she came to the door that afternoon, they knew she had somehow heard I was back. They figured, better to let us talk it out. maybe then, Willow would stop holding on. When Willow saw me enter, her eyes lit up and she quickly stood up. Meanwhile, I just felt a headache coming on. I hadn't expected her to follow me home. Didn't she always say she didn't like spending time with elders? And now she was sitting here, in my family's living room. What was she trying to do? My parents pulled me aside and quickly told me everything about the past 2 years, and how often she had come by looking for me. If they hadn't said it themselves, I wouldn't have believed it. To me, Willow never seemed to truly care about me. Why would she be so determined to look for me after I left? I couldn't understand her behavior anymore, but with the wedding fast approaching, I knew I had to deal with this before something went wrong. The last thing I needed was trouble on the big day. So Willow and I sat down, face to face. For the first time in 2 years, we were having a conversation, calm and direct. I kept my expression neutral. If you have something to say, just say it. Let's get it all out in one go. Willow's hopeful look faltered immediately. Her eyes darkened, hurt flickering beneath the surface. George, do we have to be like strangers? I tapped my fingers on the table, steady and rhythmic. Say what you came to say, I repeated. Willow's heart trembled. Her nails dug into her palm as she braced herself. She asked softly, "Back then, did you break up with me because of Makoto?" Chapter 21. I hadn't even responded when her expression suddenly shifted into a mix of anxiety and desperation. She said, "I can explain. Back then, I truly believed Makoto was the one who saved my life. I never had any feelings for him. Nothing ever happened between us, absolutely nothing. It wasn't until after you left. When you were gone, that's when I realized." Willow let out a few choked sobs, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. It took her quite a while to compose herself enough to continue. She said, "That New Year's night, 6 years ago, the person who saved me was you. I was wrong all this time." Willow looked at me with tear-filled eyes, brimming with remorse, guilt, frustration, and a flicker of hidden hope. Hope that, upon hearing the truth, I might forgive her. Hope that we could be together again. But unfortunately for her, she had miscalculated. When I realized she was referring to that New Year's night 6 years ago, I was genuinely shocked. Back then, when she introduced me to Makoto, she never said exactly when or how he had supposedly saved her. And that year, after I woke up in the hospital, I didn't mention anything about what happened that night either. I thought bringing it up would only hurt her more. And it turns out, that's where all the misunderstanding began. Even now, despite having left all of that behind, I couldn't help but find it incredibly ironic. Seeing me still silent, Willow cautiously asked, "George, I didn't keep the baby. Now that I know I was wrong about who saved me, can't we start over?" Her words pulled me out of my thoughts. I shook my head without hesitation and told her, "That's no longer possible." Willow's face went completely pale, and she staggered as if her legs could give out at any moment. My clear and unwavering answer shattered the last fragment of hope she had been clinging to. She had waited for George for 2 years, but she had never imagined this would be the ending. She truly believed, naively, that George would love her forever. With tears streaming from her eyes, she asked me, "Why? I love you." Watching how tightly she was still holding on, I couldn't help but remember how things used to be when we were together. She never gave me gifts of her own initiative. We never shared the closeness or chemistry other couples seemed to have. And not once, not even once, did she say she loved me. Even so, I was convinced she felt something for me back then. I used to think, if she agreed to be with me, it had to mean I mattered to her. I told myself that her coldness was just part of her personality. That one day, with enough patience, I would melt her heart. I clung to that delusion for 5 whole years, until Makoto came along and destroyed that pathetic fantasy completely. I could no longer lie to myself. And now, after all that, Willow says she loves me. I couldn't stop a sarcastic smile from curling on my lips. I asked her, "Are you sure, you really love me?" Chapter 22. Willow didn't understand why I asked her that. A look of confusion flickered across her face. I continued, "If you loved me," I said, "why did you never once buy me a birthday gift? If you loved me, why did you refuse to travel with me? If you loved me, why did you get pregnant with another man's child, and even take wedding photos with him? My heart is made of flesh too. I can feel pain. If this is what you call love, sorry, I don't want it." With each sentence I spoke, Willow's face grew paler. Memories came flooding back, unrelenting. She wanted to deny it, but no matter how hard she searched her mind, everything I said was true. One by one, these were things she had actually done. There was nothing to argue. Finally, Willow grasped onto the one thing she could, Makoto. But I only treated Makoto that way because I thought he was the one who saved me. She said weakly, "If I had known it was you from the start, I would never have." Enough. I cut her off. Did she really believe that Makoto was the only reason things fell apart between us? Clearly, even after 2 years, she still hadn't figured out the real reason our relationship failed. I looked at her and said, calmly but firmly. Even if it hadn't been Makoto, it would have been someone else, Kento, or Naruto, or whoever. And even if he was your savior, there were countless ways to repay him. Why did it have to be having his child? You're not really clinging to me because you love me. You're clinging because I chased you for 20 years, and now that I've finally let go, you can't stand it. Don't look for me again. Let's part ways peacefully. After those words, I showed her to the door. Willow walked home in a daze. Was it really just unwillingness to let go? She didn't know, but in her mind, a memory surfaced, the day George asked her to be his girlfriend. She remembered frowning and asking if he'd lost a dare. When he denied it, she'd simply nodded. He'd confirmed again and again, and only then did he smile. And when she wasn't looking, he'd snuck in a little victory sign with his hand. That moment had started their 5 years together. Day and night, George had been there, and she had felt his kindness. She had never thought about breaking up. The day she accepted his proposal, she had truly, sincerely wanted to spend the rest of her life with him. But now, hearing his words, she finally understood. In 5 whole years, she had never taken the initiative, never once expressed her love. George had been the only one giving, carrying their relationship on his back the entire time. And worse, when someone else appeared, she gave all her attention to that person, ignoring the pain George had silently endured. What right did she have now to ask for forgiveness? After clearing the air with Willow, I felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted. That night, I slept soundly. The next morning, I got up early to pick up the rings and gold wedding pieces we had ordered. Since we only had 2 months off, we planned to go on a 1-month world tour for our honeymoon right after the ceremony, so everything had to move quickly. Fortunately, both families were fully supportive. All Anna and I needed to prepare were the rings and our outfits. The rest was being taken care of. We'd already picked out the design months ago, so I just had to go to the store and pick everything up. After I left the shop, I took my time strolling down the street, admiring the rings and gold bracelets in the sunlight. I held one up and smiled to myself, imagining how stunning Anna would look wearing it. I didn't notice the 2 men leaning against a nearby wall. They exchanged a look and quietly began following me. As I turned a corner, a dark figure suddenly lunged out from the side and snatched the bag from my hand. I instinctively went to chase him, but behind me, I heard the sickening sound of a knife plunging into flesh. Shunk. Chapter 23. But the pain I was expecting never came. I quickly turned around and saw Willow standing behind me, her hand clutching her abdomen, her face deathly pale. Blood was still gushing out from between her fingers. She was about to collapse. I rushed to catch her, grabbing my phone with my other hand to call emergency services. Willow was already drifting in and out of consciousness, her mind drowning in waves of pain. So this is what it feels like to be stabbed, she thought back. This must have been how much it hurt when George was stabbed for her back then. Through the blurriness of her vision, she forced her eyes open. Seeing George's panicked expression, she gave a weak smile. The motion tugged at her wound and sent fresh pain surging through her body. My thoughts were a blur. I could only think of how to stop the bleeding. I pressed down on the wound with trembling hands and shouted, "Willow, stay with me. Don't close your eyes. The doctors are almost here. Just hold on." Just before she lost consciousness, she heard the sound of sirens. Paramedics lifted her into the ambulance, working quickly to stop the bleeding while notifying the hospital to prepare for emergency surgery. Willow's last sight before slipping under was George's panic-stricken face by her side. The surgery took 3 hours. Finally, the doctors announced that her condition was stable. They said the knife hadn't struck any vital organs, but the wound was deep, and the blood loss had been severe. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, my whole body slumping into the chair. My eyes moved to the bed, where Willow still lay unconscious, pale and silent. My emotions were a tangled mess. I hadn't expected it. Willow had taken a knife for me. Had she been following me all this time? But I'd made myself clear just yesterday. Why would she? I had so many questions, but until she woke up, all I could do was bury them deep in my chest. Mr. and Mrs. Liu arrived at the hospital soon after. One look at their daughter, pale, motionless, lying in that hospital bed, and their eyes turned red with grief. In their eyes, I had abandoned their daughter on her wedding day 2 years ago, and now that I had finally returned, she ended up in the hospital again. Of course they blamed me. Mrs. Liu broke down and confronted me, her voice shaking with rage. What exactly do you want from her, George? What does our Willow owe you that she has to end up like this? You left her at the altar, and now you've dragged her into this again. Why can't you just stay away? I didn't argue. I stood there silently and took the full force of her anger. There was no need to drag the past out in front of her parents. And today, Willow had truly saved me. Mrs. Liu was about to push past me again when a soft voice interrupted. George. We all turned. Willow had woken up. Mr. and Mrs. Liu immediately rushed to her side. Willow, how do you feel? Are you still in pain? She shook her head gently, then looked toward me. A mother knows her daughter best, and Mrs. Lu saw it clearly in her eyes. Willow wanted to talk to me alone, though she was clearly reluctant. One look at her daughter's frail condition made her bite back her protests. Mr. and Mrs. Lu left the room, leaving just the two of us. I stood at her bedside, looking down at her pale face, feeling a wave of emotions I couldn't name, and I finally asked, was it worth it? Chapter 24. Willow gave me a faint, weak smile. Yes, she said softly, it was worth it. I guess, this must have been how much it hurt when you saved me, right? Seeing how much it pained her to speak, I quickly tried to stop her. You should rest. Don't talk right now. But she shook her head, her voice slow but steady. I'm not here because I followed you on purpose, she said. After what you said yesterday, I thought a lot, and I finally figured it out. I treated you unfairly. I took your love for granted. I just wanted to tell you today that I regret it. I've been hesitating, not knowing how to say it. And then I saw that man pull out a knife behind you. I didn't even think. All I knew was, I couldn't let you get hurt. I never thought I'd hear those words from Willow. If it had been years ago, I probably would have been deeply moved. But now, everything had changed. I was no longer the George who loved Willow blindly. All I felt for her now was gratitude, nothing more. Willow noticed my silence and understood exactly what it meant. Still, she wanted to try, one last time. If Makoto hadn't come into the picture, she asked gently, would we have made it? I shook my head. No, Makoto had only been the trigger. In truth, my feelings had been slowly drained by her indifference over 5 long years. His appearance had only accelerated the process, even without him. Even if we had gone ahead with the wedding, Willow would never have realized just how much her attitude hurt me. In time, we would have still drifted apart. Marriage wouldn't have saved us. Divorce would have been inevitable. So in a way, Makoto's presence had saved us from more heartache. At least, it ended early. Willow clearly understood now. There was no going back. After a long pause, she asked again, can I meet your fiancé? I hadn't expected that. I blinked, momentarily stunned, before answering. If she's okay with it, then I don't mind. To my surprise, Anna agreed. Later, when Anna arrived at the hospital, I quietly closed the door behind her, leaving them some privacy. Willow looked at the woman who was about to become George's wife, and in her heart, there was no hatred, only admiration. Admiration for the woman who would get to spend a lifetime by his side. Anna noticed the heavy bandages wrapped around Willow's stomach. Her eyes softened with obvious concern. That must really hurt, she said. Such a deep wound, it must be painful. At that moment, Willow finally understood why George had fallen for Anna. Anna wasn't afraid to show how she felt. She didn't lash out or mock her, even knowing she was George's ex. And George, after 5 years of cold affection, did need someone like Anna. Someone who could speak the word love without hesitation. Someone who could make him feel clearly, undeniably loved. I don't know what they talked about, but when Anna came out, Willow's entire demeanor had changed. She was no longer stubborn, but peaceful. I asked Anna what they talked about. She just stuck out her tongue and said, secret girl stuff. I chuckled and shook my head. Women really are mysterious, I said, dropping the subject. During Willow's recovery, I visited every other day, sometimes with Anna, sometimes on my own. Now we could talk openly about the past, about the future. 2. The day before my wedding, I still made time to stop by and see her, but with so many things to prepare, I only stayed for a few minutes before getting up to leave. Just as I reached the door, Willow called out to me. George, she asked quietly. Can I come to your wedding tomorrow? Chapter 25. I agreed. That evening, I had someone deliver her a wedding invitation and a box of wedding sweets. Willow unwrapped one of the candies and slowly placed it in her mouth. It had been a long time since she'd tasted anything sweet. On the wedding day, guests flowed in and out, friends, mentors, colleagues. Even our entire lab team came. Some on leave just for the occasion. My professor clapped me heartily on the shoulder, grinning. You rascal, he said. Didn't think you'd steal away your junior. You're one lucky guy. The others all joined in with teasing laughter. I turned to look at Anna, standing by my side in her flowing white wedding dress. My heart felt so full it could burst. It was only after meeting Anna that I finally understood what unreserved love felt like. The ceremony began. I stood at the altar, watching Anna walk slowly toward me on her father's arm. When they reached me, he gently placed Anna's hand into mine. I entrust my daughter to you, he said. I looked him in the eye and promised. You have my word, I'll cherish her for the rest of my life. Then came the vows, the rings, the kiss. The hall erupted in applause and cheers. Everywhere, laughter, joy, and blessings filled the air. From a quiet corner, Willow clapped along, her eyes fixed on George without blinking. For a moment, she thought back to that wedding 2 years ago, the one that never happened. She imagined George had probably thrown himself into every single detail back then too. The planning, the venue, the dresses, the photos. He must have compared dozens of vendors for each. She realized then how much it must have hurt him to call it off. He had truly loved her, and she had let him down. Now, seeing him find his happiness, she knew she should feel happy for him. She closed her eyes. A single tear slid down her cheek. After the wedding, I spent hours seeing off guests. When I finally got a moment to rest, David walked over with a strange look on his face. He handed me an envelope. "It's from Willow," he said. "She asked me to give this to you. Also, she told me to say congratulations." He patted my shoulder and walked off. I suddenly remembered, Willow had said she'd attend the wedding, but I hadn't seen her all day. I opened the envelope and began to read, word by word. "George, I'm sorry. The truth is, I haven't completely let go of you yet, but I also know we can never go back. You were right. Life must move forward. Now it's time for me to go find my own. Those 5 years with you will always be the happiest time of my life. I'll never forget them. Lastly, please forgive me for being too much of a coward to say this to your face, but I truly wish you and Anna all the best, and a lifetime of happiness." I folded the letter and set it aside. Then I got up and went to find my bride. I had moved on to my new life, and it was time for Willow to find hers too. All that once was, is as if it died yesterday. All that is to come, begins as if it is born today.